There will be 200 operational airports in India by 2040, with 2 each in the top 31 cities. That's the stated goal of the current government to meet the rapidly growing passenger traffic in India, expected to touch or cross 1 billion by 2040. Well, we'd better get to this goalpost because our airports are bursting at their seams and are beginning to look more and more busy, just like railway stations. Airports are not just a critical infrastructure for a country's growth. We all know they also fuel a city's growth and can change the very attractiveness of a city when it comes to investments and job creation. Today in Urban Reality, we review India's airport infrastructure. How far behind the curve are we, and what will it take to get to that number of 200 operational airports by 2040 from the current 75? With me on the show today are Jagannarayan Padmanabhan, Director at CRISIL. We also have with us former commercial pilot and aviation consultant, Mr. Mohan Ranganathan, and Abhay Krishnan Agarwal, Partner Infrastructure and PPP Government and Transaction Advisory Services, EY India. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me. And my first question, I think, let me toss it across to Mr. Padmanabhan. Getting second airport in 6 cities, adding to that number of 75, you know, it seems to me is now a necessity, not even a goalpost to achieve. My question is, it all looks great on paper, but how are we going to get there? I mean, we are so slow when it comes to execution.
Yeah, so the first step is in terms of getting in the private sector in. So we already had 4 airports which got privatized, and now 6 more has got privatized. And let me also say that the experience by the private sector has been pretty good for them. They've had good EBITDA margins, and hence that has got reflected in the privatization. If you look at the airports part of it, and the number of bids which were there was close to upwards of 20. So going forward, I think this would be an area in which the private sector would be looking to participate significantly, and also it gives you an avenue for development of the greenfield airports. So going forward, with private sector capital coming in for the brownfield, experiencing the upside, they will also start to look at the greenfield, and therein lies the opportunity for development of new and further airports going through.
Mr. Agarwal, privatization, PPP, we talk about it all the time. But if I look at the track record in the last 5 years, I mean, how much of it has really happened? We're so slow when it comes to privatization. 6 out of what, 75 operational? If I take a look at the total number, it's actually 400 if I include even the smaller airstrips, etc.
Yeah, so, but it's not too late. I mean, these 6 airports should have come about 5 years back when everything was almost ready. And, but thankfully, it has now come.
Okay.
So doing next 20 would not be so much of a problem. So I see more of a silver lining.
The framework is now clearer. You feel that it doesn't matter, maybe 5 years earlier, but now we have the right framework. Do you believe that, you know, the bidding which has happened this time, at least the terms which have been set have been good enough of private excitement into the privatization story?
So I don't know, and there is no single answer, and there is no single PPP or structure which will fit into all the airports. There will be airports which will not be so much viable. There won't be so much of non-aeronautical revenue. So we'll have to think about creating maybe predetermined kind of tariff structure, just like we have for roads, etc. But I think the airport infrastructure which require very complex procurement and commercial structuring all the time, and for that reason, it should be with private sector because they can expand quickly.
Okay. And so you're saying, in other words, and very, very polite words, you're saying, why even have Airports Authority of India? Why do we need it?
Yeah, well, long term, I think Airport Authority, if they are going to regulate also on behalf of ministry, they should...
So they should play more of a regulation role and probably planning role. Let me come to Mr. Ranganathan. Mr. Ranganathan, so we keep saying 200 airports, but too little infrastructure will harm the airlines, too much capacity will harm the airports. So how do you review this 200 number? I mean, is it enough or is it too much?
To start with, you know, when you talk of numbers, like earlier, if you remember, Praful Patel said we're going to have so many airports in 5 years. Now the same dialogue is going on, and you see airlines bringing in more and more aircraft. They don't have pilots to fly them. And if you look at the air traffic controllers, as of last year, there were 600 air traffic controllers short. You can't have an aircraft flying unless you have the qualified manpower. So when you're thinking of expanding, instead of shooting numbers just to, you know, win votes or win popularity, they must see if you have the professionals to run them there. Now take, for instance, if you take Mumbai, we've been talking of Navi Mumbai Airport for so many years. The mile is super saturated. They're actually pushing to the limits. But the most important thing to note when you talk of urbanization, now you have, if you want to build within or near the cities, except for Hyderabad and Bangalore, where they built them far away from the city, the others, when they try to bring it, you don't have the infrastructure to reach the airports. When you talk of big cities,
Mr. Ranganathan,
there are far too many.
Let me come to that a little bit later. So you've raised a very important question. I mean, you have this ambition of 200 airports. Where's even the trained manpower? But even before we come to the manpower, I think it's important to understand what goes into making of an airport. And you have land acquisition. Now, the incremental land requirement for airport expansion is expected to be about 150,000 acres. You also need capital and, you know, huge amount of capital which has to be committed to these 200 airports. Where will it come from is my question. Mr. Padmanabhan, back to you. Look at what is happening with Navi Mumbai and Jewar. So it's the process of land acquisition which is required if you want to plan out an airport which is going to have enough capacity for the next 50, 100 years. You need large parcels of land. Is there any thought in terms of, other than land pooling, which the government keeps talking about, how do we actually get to cracking that problem of land acquisition?
Yeah, so I think the way to approach the airport development at a higher level would be to have a differentiated development strategy. It can't be a one-size-fits-all kind of an approach. You don't really need high amount of land for every airport that you build out. Yes, obviously, because an airport is there, the numbers is between about 2,000 to 2,500 acres kind of land would be needed. But it's not necessary that you need to always have additional non-aeronautical revenue, city-side kind of a development at each and every kind of an airport. So if I look at the Tier 2, Tier 3, you really just need airports just for the land in context of the runway and the overall development of it. Mind you, a single runway can support close to about between give or take 15 to 20 million passengers, and that's quite a lot in terms of the saturation that individual Tier 2 and Tier 3 airports will come to. So coming back to your question of land development and the need, so we just need to really document and see what is needed at each of those airports and where this can come up, and appropriately go ahead and identify those land parcels. As another panelist pointed out, connectivity becomes an important aspect. So if you are able to get good connectivity, put this all together in a place, I think this is something which is achievable. We have done that in the roads part of it. Significant amount of improvements has happened in terms of the acquisition of land. Still there are things to go by, but that has happened there. I don't see any reason that in an airport you would not be able to do that.
All right, fair point. You're saying that, you need very large land parcels only in larger cities. In smaller cities, for a single runway in Tier 2, 3 cities, actually that may not even be a big challenge. So let's come to finances and capital, Mr. Agarwal. Requirement now touted is expected to be about $40 to $50 billion. Now, there hasn't been too much interest from foreign capital, though we keep talking about the fact that this is quite mouth-watering for foreign capital also to look at as a long-term investment. Why is it that?
So, of course, the foreign capital, they don't find such projects in the initial stage very attractive, particularly because of competitive issues. But you are getting money from Indian investor. That should not be bad. And
so 40 to 50 billion, you're saying, is not a big...
40 to 50 billion is
big
not
number at all. We shouldn't worry about finances at all.
Not at all, in fact. So, and if you see the already developed airport where private sector is there, there's a lot of foreign equity, private equity funds, etc., which are coming. And at the end of the day, there is investment. So I don't see any problem in terms of funding per se for airports because it's attractive. But what you were saying about the new airports, etc., I think we should understand that 200 airport is a notional number. And
I'm glad to hear that.
We may not need those airports because 80% of the traffic is handled by few, maybe 20 airports. And
so
we need to...
getting the second airports is probably in the 31 cities, which are some of them which have actually exceeded capacity now, like Bangalore, is far more critical than looking at that big 200 number.
Absolutely. Second thing is that in terms of shifting the hub. So everybody need not fly to Delhi or Calcutta or Bombay. I think that kind of thing also can happen where the hub shifts. And if you have to go from one place to another place, instead of going to Delhi or Bombay to change your flight, you can go to some else destination.
So you need more regional connectivity rather than, going through the hub and spoke model, which we tend to do. Okay, Mr. Ranganathan, just coming back to now, looking at the different airport models and how it can accelerate urbanization. I mean, frankly, right now we have about 5 million people getting employed at airports. The potential is about 25 million people who can be employed at airports. So this is also something which is very exciting for a city. You get an airport, I mean, the land prices start going up, people start feeling there'll be more investments and employment opportunities, but it doesn't always happen. How do we get that piece right?
See, like when you talk of the value of land and infrastructure, the problem for cities is you have certain restrictions on what kind of buildings you can have around the airports, the heights. When you have a lot of multi-story buildings, like there is already a demolition order in Bombay and Delhi. So you cannot just put an airport, it's not like roads where you can choose the layout. But an airport requires a lot of technical data, including the soil testing, because like take for instance, the parallel runway they had planned for Chennai. They found that the soil is not fit enough for a parallel runway, that area. So it is not easy to decide on the location of the airport as you can for roads and other structures. But when you're talking of the biggest problem for airports will be the nexus between the real estate and politicians, because when they start giving clearances and you're actually infringing on safety. So if you say that you're going to be building 200 airports, like the other person said, 200 is a no-show number. If you think of developing what we have with the qualified manpower we have, build them up to world-class standards, and then slowly build up. But you cannot, like many of the airlines have brought in aircraft, there's no place to park, so they have to go to the Tier 2 and Tier 3. There's no traffic for that sector. So when you talk of a very high growth rate, but without the proper planning, you've got to plan 5 years ahead for aviation. You can't plan it 1 or 2 years ahead. It's got to be 5 years ahead. See how Singapore does, whether they build Terminal 3 or Terminal 4, they plan way ahead. They see the traffic potential, and then they build the structure. And they also get the connectivity. But without the connectivity, there's no point in having all those big structures. Like you're talking of Bangalore being saturated. That was known right from day one. And then you have a problem because you've got 2 Air Force fields on either side. So you have a very narrow corridor in which they can approach. Right. So when you have that kind of a situation, it's not easy to locate an airport close to a city.
Fair enough. So what you're saying is that, look, whatever we have is probably a thing of the past. We should have done it a long time ago. We are already bursting at our seams. Well, let's come back and look at it a little bit more. Also, the entire planning around airports. I mean, if a city has to become a robust urban center, it doesn't mean just put an airport there. You also have to have multimodal connectivity, which something like Delhi is completely missing. And we'll also look at the Airport Authority of India's plans to privatize 6 airports. Well, Adani bid has been the highest. What do we expect out of that? Yes, it's become far more affordable to fly today than even 5 years ago. And India's aviation industry is booming with passenger traffic rising at a very fast pace, or the fastest pace anywhere in the world. Well, that's the good news. And the bad news is India's airport infrastructure is jammed to capacity. Our airports simply can't keep up with the increased traffic. I'm going to come back to you, Mr. Agarwal. We were talking about we don't need 200. 200 is a notional number. But then there is this excitement that, smaller cities are getting new airports, and that's becoming an economic fuel. Private money flowing into, sure, Bangalore, Hyderabad, Delhi, Kolkata. These are large airports. Will it move into smaller cities?
Yeah, it can move into smaller city with a different model. So, the passenger fee could be higher or government need to subsidize a little bit. At the end of the day, you must know that government is investing in infrastructure. So it's not a big deal.
So the government's already said, I mean, the smaller airports, we are going to create a fund and we will invest in it. So is that enough?
No, that won't be enough. So what we need to also energize is the private sector airport policy, which never took off.
Okay.
There is theoretically a policy where private sector can totally build airport on its own land. And today we have a lot of industries, etc., and where we want to build smaller airports. And they have land, etc., and where they also need to fly and they take chopper, etc., where they can use their existing land and airstrip, etc. And
so you're saying open that up completely to the private sector?
Absolutely.
Let me get Mr. Padmanabhan here. Sir, do you believe that we should open it completely to private sector and allow them, if they have land parcels, to actually create small airports?
Yeah, it's a welcome step to always have an open sky policy and get in more private sector into this. But let me just step back and also say that even in terms of the current development, ERA kind of quasi guarantees about close to 15 to 16% return on the capital. So if somebody were to just look at the aeronautical part of it and build infrastructure and not really look at the non-aero part of it, and is happy with a 15 to 16% return, private sector can come in quite significantly in other tier 2 cities also, where the real estate potential is minimal, and hence it can broad base and get that into it. Yes, I do agree with Mr. Agarwal that we need to kind of look at beyond the current PPP parts of it, be a bit more open in getting in the private capital. What excites the private capital today also is in terms of brownfield assets, and that's what has got good participation from the private people for the existing airports as well.
So
I don't see
any
dearth of private capital.
Private capital coming into brownfield projects. I mean, the recent big news has been, of course, how the Adani Group has snapped up 6 contracts for modernizing airports. It's also got into a little bit of controversy. Now, I'm not going to touch the controversy part of it, but just help me understand from your point of view. I mean, if you look at the bids, which are so widely different between GMR, which is a experienced operator, vis-a-vis Adani, which has bid aggressively, do you believe that this could be unsustainable in the long term or not really?
So I think we should actually look at all the bids in totality, right? And not look at probably the H1 and the last, which is the H4 or H5. If you look at the differential between the first and the second, it's been between, give or take, 15 to 20%, except for probably, if I'm not wrong, one airport, which is Mangalore, where the difference was quite significant. Other than that, at each of the places, between the successful bidder and the second one, it's been about 15%. And that's quite normal in any of the bidding processes if you were to look at it, be it in the port sector, in other infrastructure sector. 15% to 20% variation significant is quite normal. I think what stands out is that it's just that there's one person or one entity were able to lap up all the airports, and hence probably a bit more focus has come in that context.
Right. I think their bids were, the most aggressive in all 6 airports. I think they want to make a bid to become the big player. Mr. Ranganathan, final question to you. I mean, this was actually done to break the duopoly, so-called GVK-GMR duopoly. The government said that let's allow companies without any prior experience as well to bid for projects. But, you've got so much experience in the sector, and do you think that the duopoly needed to be broken, or do you worry that 6 airports in the hand of one developer operator is a bit too much of a risk for the country to take?
It is too much of a risk to start with. And, someone else was talking about the passenger fees. Now, I don't know how many of you are aware that in the 80s and 90s, they introduced a thing called the foreign travel tax on your tickets. And that was supposed to have been for airport development. But that fund was diverted for meeting the fiscal deficit. So here also, when they collect the fees, is there any accountability on whether it is being put back into the airport development? That's what you've got to see. Like if you look at, the Adani is bidding for 6 airports and they have 0 experience. Now, even if you look at GMR or GVK, it's not that other gentleman was talking about 15% return. In aviation, I haven't heard of anything more than 4 to 6% return, but 15% is a tall order. And most important, the government does not have as fixed civil aviation policy. They keep changing it from time to time. When the ballpark and the goalpost changes, then the confidence of any foreign investor will go. And that's the reason why we are languishing.
Well, I'm afraid we've run out of time, but you've raised an important point in terms of where is the revenue going. But that's a larger question we'll discuss and debate on another episode. Meanwhile, let me thank all my panelists, Mr. Padmanabhan, Mr. Ranganathan and Mr. Agarwal. Thank you very much for joining me today. And of course, at the end of the day, we need to get our airport infrastructure story right, or else air travelers like us will get or air travel will get a lot more painful, full of delays, both at crowded terminals and even in the skies.